Growing ties between China and Africa. So where are relations headed? Hello, I'm Naidu, and this is The Heat. Over the last few weeks, Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Qin Gong has welcomed several of his counterparts from Zimbabwe, Ethiopia and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This as multilateral cooperation and strategic development strengthen between China and the African continent. So how will this growing relationship impact the international order? To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Cape Town, Sanusha Naidu is a foreign policy analyst. We also have Joseph Ochieno from Kampala, Uganda. He is a writer and commentator on African affairs. And from Beijing, we're joined by Einar Tangen. He is a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute and chairman of Asia Narratives. Welcome to all of you to the show. Einar, as I said, we've seen a number of African leaders recently in Beijing holding talks with Chinese officials. The relationship between China and the African continent is one that's been nurtured. It has been growing. It's not without its criticism, though, and we'll get into some of that in a moment. But right now, how would you characterize the relationship? Why is it so important for both sides?
Well, I mean, China is, a great export for a destination for a lot of these African countries. But this is a story about cobalt, corn, railways, debt. And it's a situation where right now you have not only China trying to help in Africa, long-standing, but you also have the United States trying to move, it seems, to block. They're proposing a railway which would be in competition with a Chinese project that's already underway that would take 60%, take cobalt from the DRC. Right now, cobalt, which is essential to batteries, is about 60% sourced from Africa for the Chinese market.
Sanusha, the 12th meeting of the China-Africa Think Tank Forum, it wrapped up in China just this past week. African leaders have been looking at Chinese development models, China's path to modernization, as it's sometimes called. There are, of course, lessons to be learned. But what are the main takeaways from that? And can African countries replicate the successes that China has had with its development?
I think the issue of Africa's development pathway and utilizing a model that essentially adapts itself to Africa's structural conditions is something that African countries, and in particular now with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement deepening and ratified, it has to define that according to what Africa's structural economic conditions are. I think they can actually adapt and look at how the successes and challenges and difficulties other countries have engaged in terms of their own economic development model or industrialization pathway. But for Africa right now, the challenges are really around understanding a number of key structural conditions. Most importantly is how do you actually create cross-border trade? How do you develop the infrastructure for logistics and transport and trading goods and services? How do you deal with the differentiation of economies, particularly along the lines of if you're moving towards deeper inter-Africa trade, deeper market integration, as well as regionalism. And I think the relationship that African countries have with China is they appreciate the kind of model that China has. But I think both sides are more cautious in coming out and saying this is the blueprint. And this is perhaps why the Washington Consensus and the kind of economic models that have been the gatekeepers of the global economic system for the longest time ever have actually now reached a point where we saw in the US the Biden administration talking about a post-Washington consensus. Trade is a very interesting space right now in terms of the kind of competition we're seeing with regard to the infrastructure, competition between Africa's partners in the global north, as well as emerging actors from the global south, and in fact China. And these kinds of competition around investment, trade, infrastructure, and so forth, as well as investment in global continental public goods is part of this kind of deepening geopolitical rivalry and competition we're seeing. So I think the pathway for Africa right now is to understand how the resources that play a critical role in Africa's economic development trajectory is actually utilized to do industrialization at home, and how this can then complement into the global value chain of production, etc. And I think this is where we are right now.
Right, Joseph, great to have you with us. Let's look at some of the numbers in this relationship. According to China Daily, in 2022, two-way trade between China and Africa reached $282 billion. African agricultural exports to China recorded positive growth for 6 consecutive years, and China has remained Africa's largest trading partner for 14 years in a row. Of course, those are very impressive figures, but we know that relationships are not static things. They do change. So what do you see as the main challenges to more growth in the coming years?
I think I must say that I am actually, while thinking about this, rather surprised that it has actually taken thus far for Africa and China to reach to the stage in which we are at the moment when it comes to questions of particular of trade and, if you like, economic development. Because historically, the foundation is actually rather solid. As far back as about 15 to possibly 18 years, but about 15 or so years ago, I was in a major SADC nation state, and I was having a conversation with a senior Southern African diplomat. And he was saying that, look, China-Africa trade and relations is the way, and up to that time, some of these things were possibly merely nuances, and in some cases, rather new. But that said, I think, from the point of view which has just been raised by my colleague from down south, many of those are actually centrally the issue that we are 54, 55 nation states, substantially fragmented. Our economies are not as interdependent as they should be on themselves. So therefore, developments around infrastructure are major challenges. Developments in terms of trade within our own selves are huge contradictions. But generally, as a continent, the goodwill is there. I mean, the road leading to my own residence down hardly 50 meters away from here, the supervisor of that project is, without prejudice, of a Chinese identity and national, almost certainly. It is the case that also that Africa actually has huge goodwill than I think the West initially thought until very recently, as far as China is concerned. Because I want to politicize this a little bit. That China was around at the time of the Cold War. China was around at the time when African countries were seeking, particularly Southern Africa, and the rest of them, particularly Southern Africa, seeking for their quest for liberation.
Right.
And China was around, and China attempted this very specific project with Tanzania. I'm not quite sure, the Tanzan rail, I'm not quite sure why Africa did not seize this, nor did China do it the other way around. Yeah. But actually, as already been suggested, now the new situation is, if you see the opportunities for cobalt in Congo and many other hungry materials which China must be looking into, Africa has simply woken up to find a decent alternative to, if you like, the traditional Washington consensus. So how this is managed both politically, socially, and, if you like, economically is the challenge, as it were. But I think the future is very interesting. Okay,
Sanusha, you were talking a moment ago about infrastructure on the African continent. And of course, as many countries develop, there's a growing demand for infrastructure. There's also a growing demand for finance for that infrastructure. How do you see China's Belt and Road Initiative fit into the needs of African countries?
I think it's very much part of the objectives and purpose for African countries' economic development. I mean, if we look at the whole question around transport infrastructure and logistic connectivities, it's important to understand that the markets in Southern Africa, if I look at the region that I'm from, are so interconnected in terms of being landlocked and being able to access their goods and services both within bringing goods from the ports into inland countries, and they're exporting goods out of those countries to ports. I mean, if you look at that project in terms of the relationship Angola, has with China around the whole Lobito corridor, but also in terms of the Benguela Railway, etc. These are key infrastructure portals, and these kinds of economic corridors are critical. But we also have challenges, and we've got to be very kind of honest about the challenges that exist within the region. And these challenges are the relationship in terms of moving across several African countries, the kind of challenges in terms of building the railway, and of course making sure that these ports that we're looking at, some of them, for example, in South Africa, are over congested and some of them are not being maintained. So we're looking at also the building of new ports and how these ports can actually act as important opportunities for African countries to find the way in which they can move their goods and services. But beyond the transport logistics and the kinds of economic corridors, I think we have to talk about infrastructure and technology. I mean, one of the key things that China has been engaged in, and it does actually have a positive impact for Africa, is around data connectivity, data access, and open access. And these are things that we are moving towards in the 21st century and beyond, in terms of how ICTs are going to play a critical role, not just in the context of the way markets are going to operate in Africa, but also in terms of how commerce is going to become digitized, and the technological impact as well. So I think these are infrastructure points that we need to think about beyond just the whole kind of traditional interpretation of the market, but beyond the market towards the digitalization of trade and commerce. And this means that people's lives and livelihoods will be impacted in a positive way.
I know, I was saying earlier on that this is a relationship that is not without criticism, and one bit of that criticism that is often leveled at China is that its investments in South Africa actually land many of those African countries into what has been described as a debt trap. A lot of that criticism comes from the city where I'm sitting in right now, but how would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, everybody acknowledges the infrastructure deficit that exists not only in Africa, but in the global South. Yet when somebody tries to do something about it, they're accused of debt trap diplomacy. Well, where was the U.S.? If there's this need and it needs to be filled, the U.S. is not doing it. So, you know, Washington is kind of playing it a little loose here. You can't have it both ways. If you're not going to help, don't complain about somebody else doing it. But China learned a very valuable lesson, and that is loans directly to governments are probably not going to be much in the future. I think it's going to be project-based financing. And for Africa, I think it would be best if it was bought, build, own, and turn over. This would allow Chinese companies to come in, build it, operate it, get their return as promised, and then turn it back over to the country. This eliminates the need for debt and would obviously, based on the feasibility, if there's a problem, it's going to be on the Chinese side of the equation. I think that makes a lot more sense. And things like that, different kinds of structures that do not load down the countries with debt, but still give them the infrastructure they need.
Joseph, talking about finance, BRICS, the BRICS countries now have the New Development Bank. To what extent does the New Development Bank provide or is an alternative to other institutions like the World Bank and the IMF? And we are, of course, aware that when you get a loan from the IMF or the World Bank, it comes with a lot of strings attached.
I think that's very important. It's obviously exciting. It was having conversations with some of my colleagues, noting that the new president of the new bank is a rather progressive left leader, former leader of Brazil. How this is managed, because one of the challenges that the West, Washington particularly, if you like, had with Africa is the perception that perhaps quite true, that most of the agendas and program came not only with strings, but perhaps this very specific narrative, which was basically driven beyond the interests of the ordinary people. So BRICS as a bloc and the nation states of BRICS, as I said at the beginning, the perception about them, and I hope if those perceptions can be translated into reality, if then this bank and the finances and the monies and the projects and the developments, the issues that you just raised with our colleague down there, if they can actually be looked with slightly much more human face than the manner in which perhaps other colleagues had managed to do it, it would mean therefore that the bank would be seen as a soft a soft friend, a soft, realistic commercial and business friend to the African continent than the Bretton Woods institutions have been. But that said, also, it is the case, isn't it, that this is a new imperative, that while the dollar is going to continue dominating the global trade for a long time, it sends a signal of relief to African leaders and African governments. But of course, does not mean, therefore, that there's going to be easy, cheap, free money. But really the message that, well, there's a sense of independence, a sense of leadership from the alternative, a sense of financing, which perhaps, as I said, is one which is not as biting as it has been with the Bretton Woods institutions by implication and by practice. And if I may say so just very quickly, yes, one of the short challenges of this relationship thus far is that between Kampala and where I am and our international airport, Entebbe, is the Entebbe Express Highway built by Chinese funds and is now considered one of the most, perhaps one of the two most expensive roads in the world. The perception around China, unfortunately, is that China came in basically to suck up some of this money. So I don't think actually China got very good PR from that. If you go into the details in terms of the financing of the projects, it's neither here nor there. It's an imperative. It's part of a project that was actually initially thought of way back in the 60s, but these guys didn't pick it up until much more recently when, as I said, Chinese finances were available. How then the BRICS banks, in terms of capitalizing themselves and mobilizing their resources and translating whatever they're able to pull as finances of projects in Africa, working side by side, in this case with China as the bigger brother in this program, is going to be very important. So I think actually, notwithstanding everything else, BRICS, when and as it builds as a bloc, as a political bloc, as an economic bloc, it should also build as a cultural bloc, and should also be seen to be building as a bloc that, if you like, has got a human face on the continent, because that, in my opinion, is something which is going to help them enable and create the possibilities in which this financial institution, when it comes up, I will not be surprised that many more Africans will be looking towards it.
Sanusha, I want to turn for a moment to some of the more strategic aspects of this relationship. I mean, in recent years, we've seen a growing assertiveness among African countries when it comes to their relationships with the major powers. I mean, most recently, we saw that with the conflict in Ukraine, where African countries refused to be drawn into backing one or the other. In many instances, they've remained neutral. Are we going to see more of that?
I think, this is an inflection point for the global system. I think the Ukraine conflict represents a kind of challenge that the architecture of the global international order has reached this point of where are we? Are we in a unipolar, a multipolar, a bipolar? We're kind of finding that kind of identity with the characterization of the international system caught between very different orders right now. And you've got this one kind of approach where the challenge is the geopoliticization of development, trade, deepening that in the context of how it's being used in terms of politicizing the whole development architecture as an instrument for defining where you sit in the context of the conflict. I think the reaction by the African countries at the UN in terms of abstaining tends to get misinterpreted by those that want to see the African bloc as kind of taking a stance against Russia, but at the same time aligning with the developed North and those countries that basically are in favor of a much more aggressive Ukraine and trying to sanction the Russians. But I think they don't understand what that meant. That abstention or the need to demonstrate the agency that African countries have in the UN and in particular in the G77 is that they're not saying that it's either or. They're saying that there has to be a return to the question of what is the role and utility of the UN Charter and what it does it mean when you talk about the role of the UN in terms of peace and stability and the kind of questions around the dynamics of the various chapters of the UN Charter. I think the other point to make here on the role of Africa in going forward around this agency that we're talking about is this question around how the conflict in Ukraine is becoming that kind of transactional action of what needs to be done in the international system. And that becomes problematic because it's now about how do you reduce the entire international system to a very kind of winner versus loser kind of approach. And this is the problem with the international system right now, is that the gatekeepers after 1945, even in the context of the 1919 peace treaty of Versailles and the whole Woodrow Wilson peace plan, etc., is a very reductionist and a very kind of system that's not built for peace. It's actually built for more kind of instability. And that's critical because this is now going to create undue impact of influence, but also impact on the African development agenda. And I want to draw in the question on climate change. And I think climate change and the just energy transition, which is really critical as well in terms of China's green economy and the Belt and Road Initiative, and also linked to the Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative about human security, is critical because this is where Africa is caught in the crosshairs of secondary sanctions, caught in the crosshairs of the payment system where it's paying more in terms of transactional cost when it comes to the SWIFT banking system and so forth. So I think the BRICS itself, just one last point on this, the BRICS itself is important to understand that the new development bank is really about how the financing is going to take place, the kind of loans, etc. And we do know that there's the African Regional Office here in Johannesburg, in South Africa, and that is basically financing the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, etc. But it needs to expand to other infrastructure projects. I think the big question for the BRICS going forward, apart from expansion, etc., is the question of the interpayment system and how that's going to be critical to not necessarily de-dollarization, but in order to reduce transactional costs. And this is going to be critical for Africa as well.
Anna, what are your thoughts on these changing alliances, these new alignments that we are now seeing? And of course, China is at the center of many of these changes that we see. If we look at, for instance, the continent of Africa, for much of the 20th century, it was literally the battleground for much of the Cold War. But that has now changed, as Sanusha points out. African countries are demonstrating more and more that they have agency right now. So how do you see these changes?
Well, I mean, I'd go back a little bit further. I mean, you had the meeting of the G7, which represents 7 countries that grew rich based on exploiting and using colonialization. Africa was amongst the victims of that. At this juncture, Africa has choices, but it's not monolithic. I think I would disagree with my colleague that there's somehow one view. Obviously, there are many. Some view China very favorably. A lot of it has to do with the nature of democratic politics. If China gave a loan to one party and they're out of favor, the next party is bound to come in and criticize them. I think that is something that China has to avoid. And as I said before, the key to that is doing project financing that has, feasibility studies that make sense and try to keep the debt away from the countries itself. At this juncture, though, politically, most countries are just looking out for themselves. And this is the weakness of a multipolar system. You have to have some sort of principles that you're working on. Otherwise, everyone's just kind of trying to be very, very transactional, asking for things, but not necessarily delivering on them.
Joseph, what are your thoughts on the strategic relationship between China and the African continent?
I think as seemingly has been suggested, and I think I presented this, like many nuances at the beginning, that historically this is possibly a relationship come sort of too late. But generally, some of the concerns at the moment is that while on the one hand, their governments and their parties and their organizations that may be seeing some of these things as opportunistic and short-term, it's also generally the case that Africa, and for Africa, it's extremely important that we look long-term and strategic. Part of the complex element of this, of course, is the fact that, again, we are not one country. We are a series of countries. And I'm not quite sure whether as a continent there is sufficient coordinated thus far a strategic manner in which the continent is harnessing its opportunities, one from a resource basis versus the rest of the world, in this case, particularly China, in relation to what they actually strategically want. A quick example, there was a conversation and investments over a rail network here in Kenya, which by and large is quite successful. It ended near my border town of Malaba, Tororo. And the perception by the Ugandan side, while, and we're talking about ordinary citizens, and thankfully in terms of my experiences, I engage with the people. People basically believe whatever happened has been the result of a failure by China, when actually at the end of the day, we know that many of these things are actually things which are complications that have arisen as a matter of national state policy programs. So I think generally long-term, and particularly because of the manner in which I think our global North friends took us for granted for a rather long time, and particularly because, talk about Ukraine, when they seem to come and present a rather instructive position for the African continent, the reality came out that actually no, Africans actually see themselves not only as relatively independent for themselves, don't forget the non-aligned movement conversation, which was over 50 years ago, but the continent had almost nearly forgotten, to the reality that actually we can actually engage now constructively, but with both sides. So I think for the continent, going forward, as far as these relations are concerned, we should be able to trade with China and build and strengthen relations, and there is opportunity for growth, particularly culturally, as I said, and socially, and at the same time also be able to engage with the rest of the world, meaning the global North, but on terms which is equal, fair, and one which is respectful. I think that is where an area where still there is general work that needs to be done from both sides.
Sanusha, just one final point. I've just got about a minute left, and that is the BRIC Summit that will take place in South Africa in August. Of course, this summit will be taking place at a time when we're sitting on the threshold of a major expansion of the group. But what do you see as the priorities for the BRICS meeting?
Well, I think the priorities are going to be questions around the BRICS interpayment system, BRICS Pay, which I think is critical. There's going to be questions around, expansion criteria. They haven't decided on criteria yet. They're still debating that. It's a work in progress, as we've been learning from the BRICS foreign ministers meeting that took place last week. And I think what's also critical is how do they basically deepen inter-BRICS cooperation. This is not expansion, but rather the relationship between each of the BRICS countries that will basically about how they move forward in the next cycle or trajectory of the BRICS, and whether or not you institutionalize the BRICS in terms of creating a secretariat. And I think these are questions around where the BRICS is going to be going in terms of its identity, but I think it's not going anywhere despite what you see as criticisms leveled at the BRICS.
Right. And that's where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That is all the time we have for. I'm Einar Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching.